Hi, everyone.
Hi, Sana.
Hi, Bernard. Should we get started or should we wait for a few more minutes for others to join? I'll wait 1 more minute. Hi, Kaushik. Kaushik, we were giving it last minute for everybody else to join.
Yeah. Hello, everyone.
Kaushik, should we get started now?
Let's start.
Kaushik, I didn't run the previous call. Do you mind kicking off from where we left off? I think we're hoping to get the working groups updates as well. Anything else that we should summarize from the last call?
Yeah, a few things. So there were a few action items that I had captured in the meeting notes document, but then at a broad level, one, we are still waiting on each of the working groups to compose key topics from the Dev Summit that happened 2 weeks ago and capture some of the action items. I last I looked a few days ago, the document structures that we had shared with each of the working groups, they were all empty. So there were no updates. So we had talked about this. I had requested, especially the key owners for each of the working groups. So that was one topic. Uh, the second thing that I remember was some of the working groups have not been meeting. They were just conceived or other. I mean, in terms of the set of people were just formed. I think working group one needs a little bit more structure and focus. Uh, so we need to get into that rhythm of both having a regular cadence for the working groups, uh, and then bringing up the relevant topics into SIG1 meetings, right, from each of those working groups. So we need to continue to establish that cadence. I see some better structure for some of the other working groups, especially working group 2 for ORAN as an example, and a little bit for WG5 on service assurance. But regardless, we need that consistency across the working groups in terms of how each of the working groups is structured, be self-independent to an extent, and then bring the topics back to this meeting. So mm, those were the high level themes, and then there are a bunch of these action items that we also captured because there was some confusion around modeling user experience in terms of what is the definition, what is the scope, what is the intersection, and how should these especially working group 4 was a little bit confusing to the group in terms of right now it is labeled as both modeling and user experience, and they seem to be disjoint in principle. So how do we really restructure that working group for, and how does modeling fit into the ownership of each of the working groups. So those were the two or three broad themes. I don't think we have made progress on the last bullet in terms of modeling and user experience and defining the scope and goals. Uh, there were a couple action items that I have not seen any documents or any progress. But then that is where we left off last time.
Okay, Kaushik. Kaushik, I think we should just do a roundtable right now. I think since we are on that discussion, before we get to the updates from the working groups, I think we should find with the working groups if they need some help from us in establishing the cadence for them, creating the meeting invites, or if they have the access to the right documents where we are expecting to consolidate the inputs. So maybe we'll start with the working group 2 first. Looking at the ORAN, I know that Tim's working on a lot of things at the moment. Tim, do you have any updates from your side or anything else that we need to support you on the structure or the meeting side?
Yeah, I'll put all that in. I didn't realize that we needed to fill in the deliverables, but we do have a set of deliverables. Currently, we have our cadence, so we're meeting Wednesdays at 8 a.m. Pacific is what you have here,
Right.
and we're currently working on defining the integration of ORAN into the using Nefio enablers. So we're taking the ORAN architecture and finding out where the Nefio enablers would make sense. Certainly for we're trying to do the next year, but we're going to start release 3 first. Release 2 has already been basically, in the can from a definition standpoint. And so I'll add in the other deliverables. So we do have 3 or 4 deliverables from deployment architectures to use cases to objectives to, there's 3 or 4 different artifacts that you'll need prior to them starting to do their development process. So I'll add those into these deliverables for you.
Excellent. And Kaushik also mentioned there is a document that he created for the Nephew Summit takeaways and basically making sure that we know the next steps. And that document link is also shared on Slack. And I know that you already captured the summit takeaways somewhere. Like I saw the slide, but maybe it's just captured somewhere else.
For ORAN, for the working group
ORAN.
2?
Yes.
Honestly, I can't remember where the takeaways from. But I think the point that I want to try to make is that we're organized.
Yes, I see that.
and we're pushing forward. Our next step is to what I've been pushing the group towards is that certainly by I think the end of November we should come back to the network architecture team and give you at least a view of what the use cases are that we're going to do for release 3, right? Along with the functional architecture that we'll try to utilize the Nefio enablers for.
Perfect. Yeah, Tim, I'm aware. I know a lot of momentum is happening, I think, in that particular working group right now. So Kaushik, I think when Tim put together his initial set of slides for the kickoff meeting in the working group 2, I think a lot of his ideas from the summit and a lot of our discussions during the summit was baked into that presentation, and he already captured that. So like explicitly doing that exercise to gather the takeaways and the discussions from summit, if it's captured in the existing living documents, I think we should be fine with that as well, right?
Yeah, that's fine. I think it was less about trying to create a process. I thought when we discussed on this topic 2 weeks ago, we also wanted to capture some of the action items that would emerge as a follow-up to the Dev Summit, because I'm sure there are key themes in the Dev Summit, and each of the working groups, as they discuss, they'll come up with a set of key follow-throughs or key topics of focus, right? That is what we should capture, not just what was discussed, but what do we need to follow up on. If it is already captured somewhere, please do link it from the Nefio wiki, and or just update it on the Slack channel so all of us are aware. But in the meeting notes documents, and I have repasted all the template docs that we had created for this process.
Perfect, Kaushik. So Kaushik, I think we are green for working group 2 right now. A lot of good progress is happening. The weekly meetings are set. We have the primes identified. The primes know what they're doing. Anybody who's interested in attending those meetings, they can subscribe to the calendar. The invite is created on SIG Architecture calendar, and you guys can subscribe to receive those invites, and you can join and listen in. If you're interested in ORAN, I think otherwise we're all green on this effort at the moment. The working group through, in my view, this is not a working group that would continue to work the whole time. I feel this is a working group that can actually come in action closer to the release and could be, there are many ways in which the RX scope and user stories working group can operationalize. Maybe they receive input from all other working groups, and closer to the roadmap, they can see the feasibility, the priority, and can find ways on how to recommend the high priority user stories and the ones that are closer to execution. And somebody from SIG automation can also join this ad hoc working group closer to the submission of our requirements for the SIG automation. I think that would make sense rather than meeting every week or every 2 weeks at this point in time, as the user stories from other working groups are evolving at this stage. What do you feel, Kaushik?
Yeah, I think that sounds reasonable.
Yeah, because we had an exercise like that closer to the R2 planning as well, where we had formed a group which was meeting 2 or 3 times a week. So similar to that, I think we can create this exercise, working group 3, the RX scope and user stories, very close to the finalization of our scope and requirements closer to the release, and just keep it ad hoc. Now the next group.
I think just one process that we need to establish is, I would say, just given our experience for R2, it took us about, I would say, close to 1.5, 2 months from when we started discussing to when we somewhat landed. And even the landing in terms of defining the CUJs and the scope was not also perfect, rightfully so, right?
Right.
Working backwards from the date when R3 is going to start, right? So what I'm hearing from SIG2, and we should probably get an update from SIG2 here as well, is SIG2 will not, the R2 release may not complete by November as we had previously projected or discussed, but it will be sometime in mid-December. So let's, again, if we work backwards from whatever the R2 release date, I would say start the R3 ad hoc process 6 weeks at the least before the release date of the previous release, so that we ensure that by the time whatever release gets completed, that the process for the next release is completed by working group 3.
Right, it's a good discussion, Kaushik. Let's put some tentative dates. So, and these are just tentative. I know that we don't know everything about the R3 release date yet. When would be the R3? When will we start the R3 work? Right after December?
I would say, I mean, just again, if we were to just, without having all the information, and Wim, you should weigh in as well, is we should say, hey, first week of January is when, right after the holidays is where the R3 implementation work should start. So we should just, and we've got literally 2 months from that time. So let's just use that as the benchmark to start to, the WG3 process.
Yeah, November 15th should be start of this work group. What do you feel?
Yeah, it's Wimir. What do you mean with start of the working group? I mean, I think we have a so sorry, yeah, I raised my hand, but yeah. So what so Tim asked this question for ORAN, right? When should we have? So let me give 2 statements probably.
I get your question. Go ahead.
One is when should we be ready to be considered to be part of release 3 scope, right?
Right.
So that's
I think the working groups working groups should have some user stories ready by November 15th, so that when this working group starts the prioritization and looking at the relative user stories stack, we should have something to discuss at that time.
Yes, but I mean, is it realistic, right? Because
no, it's not realistic. I'm already worried about the time already.
Yeah, so that's why I'm saying is like, let's be realistic between ourselves, but also let's agree on what level of detail we want, right? Because what we have seen, so my experience is the following: if you look what we did in R1, right, the difference is very compared to R2 is very different, because in R1 we kind of had a proof of concept that was finalized in November, okay?
Right.
Which was the One Summit proof of concept. So we kind of were going to a lot of detail already to figure out what has to happen to make certain use cases work, right? So then we defined use cases along the way, but the people who delivered R1, they had a very good sense of what to do and what not to do, and we had already some experimentation as to how it could look like. And we learned from the proof of concept, we made mistakes, and we optimized them and so on and so forth, right? Compared it to R2, we did none of that, right? And you see also that the content is very different, right? And we are struggling right now to actually to get to that date because we are still figuring out very fundamental things at this stage, which should have been already sorted out, in my view, in August, September when we started, right? So the behavior is very different. So what I'm trying to say is that if you look to R3, you almost now need to have executed a POC to be able to deliver R3.
I know. This whole,
and that's
we are,
I think
we are really behind.
Where we have a big challenge in my view. If you look to, at least that's how I look at the flow that we are going through these days. It's impossible to deliver all of these working groups in R3 in my view, unless something really drastically changes. But
So
that's the state of affairs that we have to be that we have to realize ourselves, I think.
Right. So Wim, that's my thinking. All the work that is now warming up in these working groups is basically hard work, aligning the scope, understanding the architecture, understanding Nephew's opportunities along the lines of the architecture and that vision, trying to come up with one user story, one discrete user story that we feel would be a good incremental next step towards building in R2. I think that's one thinking that has to be added in every working group's thought process. And they don't have to produce, like they don't have to boil the ocean, but they can say that one small user story, a very small incremental next step could be a potential opportunity for us to be considered in R3. And then the work that is happening on the architecture alignment, the scope understanding, the possibilities of where Nephew fits, for example, I'm looking at the ORAN architecture and what work is happening there. That work and that understanding requires time. So when Tim put together his first architectural diagram for everybody to understand the functional responsibilities of various blocks in ORAN and where could Nephew's roles fit into those blocks, that required a little bit of convergence between the working people to understand and contribute effectively. So that had to happen. But I think we have to fast forward this a little bit just to get to one user story that that working group can submit and propose that this would be something potentially a good opportunity for R3 to consider in its evolution. And that exercise has to be done at each working group. We are improving constantly, and I know that we need to be thinking way faster than how we are working. But I'm trying to find the right balance of meeting the cadence, thinking incrementally, and at the same time finding the opportunity for the working groups to brainstorm and think through the scope, the interfaces. Where does Nephew fit? I think it's a dual work happening at the same time, driving user stories at the same time, finding Nephew scope, where it fits, where the opportunities are.
Maybe let me respond quickly, Kaushik, if you don't mind. I mean, if I look to the process myself, what we have gone through, right? So and by the way, what we are doing right now is that's the way to go, right? Because we are going through an understanding of what needs to happen, how it fits together, and so on and so forth. So I'm not complaining or saying that what we are doing right now is bad or something. We have to go through this process. What I'm just trying to highlight is realizing, let's say, a core release of in R3 and that functionality. I have the feeling we have to go through a POC phase first before you actually can realize a full, let's say, quality deliverable work stream. That's what I'm trying to say, basically. And
you're very
that's
right.
That's the process we probably have to go through to so basically go from all this conceptual stuff, trying to put the architecture, building blocks in place, do a proof of concept, and then you are again be scheduled for the next release somehow. And I think that's the flow we have to think about and be realistic with respect to the timelines.
Yes, Tim, I'm completely agreeing with you. So what might happen is that For one release, this SIG architecture would propose some user stories based on the best judgment on the current state of where the current release is, the best judgment on where the priorities lie, the best judgment on where the incremental best next step feels like, and whatever we propose could become a POC, not the actual release. And for the next release, things would actually line up like you said. Like we continue to offer those opportunities in the POCs to be a POC to be started. And if the POC is mature, then that could become a part of the release. Like that would be the cycle that we can probably work on. SIG architecture, basically proposing the next set of POCs with the user stories that we feel are the most mature incremental next user stories to be picked up. Only then we'll meet the timelines for the releases and build that process.
Yeah. There's a few people raised their hands, so maybe.
Yeah, I can't see because I'm trying to type on the screen at the same time. Please, someone help them.
Kaushik is first, I think.
Yeah. So I think, Wim, those are good points. And beyond what you and Sana described, right? Couple of observations that I have. One, not everything in a release needs to be, it's okay to have a few things to be POCs, right? Like we are doing with R2, starting with an FEOSTK. So some of the planning work, the CUJs that we described could be just leading to POC development in the release. So that's point number one. The second thing, what I'm describing is the 6-week process. It's just a work backwards plan to ensure that there is a consistency in the process in terms of defining the right level of CUJs before the next release starts. Now, in terms of, hey, but what should be the pre-work before, like what you described in terms of POCs should have started now for those to be incubated in R3. Those are even like the process pre-steps, but I'm just trying to have even like a baseline process in place for planning, because we didn't have that process in SIG1 for R2 planning. The second part I would say is this working group 3 cannot be just right now. The people that I see here are mostly from SIG1. It has to be a joint SIG 1+2 ownership, and we'll have to do it in a much more calibrated way. So I would like to see people from SIG 2 who are participating very actively through this. And we have to, because otherwise the planning in SIG 1 is more not hand wavy, but more high level, and it may not really reflect what SIG 2 is looking for. And trying to close that loop later in the picture does not make sense. I think it needs to be a very tight joint working group. So those would be my two inputs. And again, we'll need to somewhat also learn along the way as a community in terms of what changes that we make to the process work in practice for R3.
Right.
So Kaushik,
100%
maybe
agreed.
just quickly, I quickly respond. So one of the things that we decided, I think last week, was basically we distinguish POCs from core Nephew functionality. So we have basically two projects, so two structures in which we two separate GitHub projects basically, or in which we put that work. So in other words, a POC will not go to core, right? So the POC will happen in the experimental Nephew project, whereas the core functionality will go into the core functionality. So we have a distinction between that level of maturity, just FYI.
Yeah, no, and that's great because when at a high level, when SIG1 is doing the planning, we don't have to necessarily worry about what is in experimental, what is in core. That's a joint decision that SIG 1+2 has to make based on where you are. So if SIG1 has done some POCs, you can take on from there, and you can then convert it from experimental to mainline. If not, if SIG2 has to do the work on POCs, then you continue doing that in the experimental. Those are all process decisions we need to make, which is exactly why I'm requesting a joint ownership for working group 3 moving forward. But all good points, ma'am. I concur with what you said and with what Sana responded.
Excellent, Kaushik. Kaushik, there are more
Tim is next.
Go ahead.
Tim is next.
Okay, yeah. So guys, I will say this, and I'm just coming from an ORAN integration perspective, right? From a working group 2. This is what we're running to. You guys can say, hey, you're running, counter cycle, or whatever you want to say. I don't care. I'm just letting you know the approach that we're taking, because again, I had a conversation with Wim earlier, right? The first thing that we're doing is we're going to define a set of that high level deployment architecture. We're having that conversation that Santa said about, what Nepio enablers can we use for the ORAN integration? Where are those at? And so we're talking about this high level deployment architecture. And then we're coming into looking at what are the objectives that we want to do in release 3. And as Wim said, for the ORAN integration, a lot of this stuff, except for probably some of the NF deployments that will extend from release 2, will be POC type of things. And then the third thing that we'll do is once we have our objectives set, we'll identify the actual user stories with a description on those user stories and epics, right? And so that set of deliverables, right, we'll bring back to the network architecture team to say, are we on target for what we're doing? And that was expected to be done. I'm trying to push the team to have a deadline of December 1st for that, right? Now there's a set of work that has to happen that Wim and his team or the automation team needs. At least this is what I realized from release 2, that they need to have some additional information on the deployment architecture, the deployment blueprints, operators, APIs, and some other SIG automation impacts that arise, right? And so there's another set of deliverables for that. And that's where I asked Wim, I said, in order to make a June meeting, when is your drop dead date for me to have these things to you so we can have these discussions? And I think Wim's response back was that, I believe, January 31st or, right before February, right? Correct me if I'm wrong,
Yeah.
but that's what I documented, right? And so
that's correct.
Well,
yeah,
let me
sorry.
finish.
Yeah.
And that's what we would be pushing to for that second set, right? So we're gonna, from an ORAN integrations perspective, we're gonna try to get the what done, the big what done, which is the use case development and what's going to be in a POC and what's not, right? To the network architecture team for blessings in December. And then the team will work on what they need to get to the network automation team to make sure that the enablers are there that we have when we want to do the integration, right? Because there's also some additional work that we have to do within Nepio that has nothing to do with network automation enablers themselves, but we're going to utilize those enablers that are there. Anyway, that's the approach. I don't know if we're going to make it or not, but given the July date and given what Wim had said that he needed for the network automation to actually have the enablers in place that we would want to utilize, right now that cutoff date's the 1st of February. And that's anyway, that's where we're at right now. I'm trying to get the ORAN team to agree to this, by the way. There's still question marks around those dates. Does that help? I don't know if that helps, but
Yes, Tim,
that's
that
where
does help.
we're running.
Yes, you guys are running in the right direction. I think it does help. And we just need to be closely working and the progress and how things are evolving in the working group and constantly bring that here, which will enable us to pick up the best opportunities.
Can I
I'll
suggest,
ask next.
before others come in, can I suggest some of us, these are all good points. We seem to be also having some confusion or some concerns generally. Should we put all of these things in a document, not specifically about R3, but as a process, right? We need a work backwards plan and a process in terms of how different working groups of SIG1 are going to create these user stories. What is the role of WG3 in this case? And how do we work backwards from the date for a new release, right? I think we should it shouldn't be a long document, but just putting it in a document will hopefully help reconcile if there are any differences.
Yeah, Kaushik,
I think that's a good. I agree with you. It probably we need to at least document a little bit the process to go through, because our release cycles are fixed basically so far, right? So we have 2 per year. So one is in November, the other one is in June. So mid-June and mid-November is what we've set, or what we agreed with in the TSE. So we can work backwards from that, and we can basically say what needs to happen within each of the timeline and which timeline we need to meet with what type of content in order to fulfill a certain date, right?
Yeah, and I would suggest, even for simplicity, we don't need to put real dates in the doc to start with, right? We assume the set of logical steps, and we put some timeline markers like T0, T1, and just have a clear process in place. And then if we have a well-established release cadence, those timeline markers map to some dates, right? Naturally speaking. So we can do that as a follow-up if that simplifies the process. But my request is we should document the process itself first.
Bala's next, I think.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, man. So there's one thing have been thinking, if you look at all these working groups, they are very big topics in itself. For example, we look at ORAN, whatever parts of the ORAN we wish to implement in FEO, or we wish to support, whether it's SMO or any particular interface or OCloud or whatever. They are very big topics. And then we have service assurance, we have observability, we have SDK, we have experience in modeling. So each and every one of these are a big topic in themselves. A single topic could consume multiple releases of Nephew if you were to focus on any one such particular working group. So I think probably this is where working group 1 comes into picture, in my view. I think working group 1 should have a bit of an overarching view and vision of how this project/product should move forward. And in terms of the use cases, whether and we should be able to tell a coherent story. I mean, these are the use cases we solved in this one. Obvious use cases for the next release is this one, because this is where the market is, this is where the demand is, this is what we are hearing from the stakeholders. I think we should have that instead of, rather in addition to each and every working group suggesting what could be the next logical step. I think the SIG group 1, working group 1 here, I think that's what, if I'm not mistaken, that's the one responsible for coming out with the work items for the releases and creating the roadmap. I think we should do that, a coherent roadmap, considering the demands, the stakeholders, lay of the land, and what makes sense to tell the story coherently.
Yeah, I'll respond to you, Balaji, of course, and others have comments, they can also chime in. So to some level, the architectural effort around the vision of Nephew, where it fits, how it fits, and what it does, and how it should do what it's supposed to do, is kind of captured in some architectural diagrams. I tried to work on that, and Tol created another version which was functionally a better decomposition of how Nephew's control plane and work clusters are looking, and the way the other north, south, east, west entities would interact with that was also kind of laid out. I'm not saying it's perfect, but that was an exercise which we did, and that creates an architecture, a high-level architecture. All the user stories that are coming out of ORAN's work, or the modeling or user experience, or the assurance work, is naturally considering that functional architectural vision of Nephew, and it's going to be compliant with that. Now, this architecture working group, you're kind of giving this working group the role of SIG architecture, the community that we have here. So driving the product vision, driving the holistic roadmap that is coming from various working groups, and how the product is driving its vision forward, I think is a more holistic and a joint exercise. When we created this working group, our first goal was to give a high-level scope for Nephew, like a diagram, which shows that how Nephew fits in the overall broader ecosystem of North, South, East, West, and the existing standards in the open source project domain, which was an exercise that we did. And the other responsibility for the work group 1 was to basically take Nephew's vision and take it to the other communities. For example, it became a part of the LFN project, present this work in the cross-functional communities for cross-pollination. So those communities can also send their reps to Nephew, and we can find a bigger momentum of trying to work with Nephew and trying to cross-pollinate that effort with the other projects. So kind of that was the high-level vision of the working group 1. And the product vision, the product roadmap, and its evolution is going to be a gray area of how various working groups are kind of evolving that. So I think it would still be an exercise carried out a little bit in ORAN, a little bit in the other working groups, and coming back to this SIG architecture meeting and helping us drive that evolution. If things needs to change on that architecture to show something differently, that would evolve. If not, then things would continue to flow like that. So that's my thought process, Balaji, around that.
Cool. Thanks, Anna. Yeah.
Should we continue to do the discussion on work group 4 and 5 as well? Make sure that they also have, if there are any raised hands to the topics we discussed, I'll take
Ravi,
couple of
Ravi is
comments. Couple of comments. Thanks, Vin. So I think one of the, because we are at the end of the day, people in the community and outside community are looking at, the how Nepio could be consumed in certain production environments, right? And the way we are trying to address is through these use case stories or use case journeys. In R1, we started off with two main use cases, right? We talked about 5GC and then workload deployments. And we did with free 5GCs, kind of showing its kind of provisioning and so on. But the thing is that, we realize that primarily R1 was just trying to kind of demonstrate some of the principles of Nepio. But the logical thing would have been to continue that 5GC use case stories into R3 too, to basically show that exactly, we start with free 5GC. Let's now delve into something more realistic in terms of how, the actual CNFs are kind of packaged and some of the new requirements that comes with it in terms of, IO requirements, core pinning or huge pages or anything like that, particularly for the UPF front perspective. And a lot of other things we're also discussing in terms of BGP and stuff like that. And to basically show, to bring it to a realization where people could actually try it in the operator labs. And similarly, also with workload deployments, we just said, okay, we had a bunch of kind of package variant sets that were actually KRMs, but we really did not define a kind of an intention management system for actually provisioning either bare metals or basically VMs, or that could basically take in this 5G core workload. So continuing those R2 stories into R3 into maturity for production consumption while doing something with ORAN. And in considering ORAN, we are still aligning on the architectural aspects and stuff. But then I don't know if anybody is actually shipping anything like cloud or even network functions with O1 or E2 kind of support. So they might, but these are all just kind of experimental from a ORAN / a VRAN perspective. To show something demo, even OAI, I don't think has any support for anything like ORAN, primarily because the maturity of specifications from ORAN itself, right? So I think that we should have the continuity story. Otherwise, people wouldn't be able to relate to some of the actual use cases that they could realize in their own backyard. So I'm surprised that we are not continuing those use cases that we started with R1, R2 into R3. Or R1 into R2, probably there's a little bit of that, but to basically show that timeline of basically the maturity of use cases that could end into something that people can actually use in the labs, right?
Yeah, Ravi, I'll quickly respond to your question and then I'll let others chime in as well. I think use cases are just a recipe. And to me, the evolution of the Nephew's internal capabilities in the form of their SDKs, the GUIs, the APIs that it produces, and the functional understanding of what Nephew can accomplish and how it accomplishes, that's the evolution and maturity of Nephew that would help the service providers adopt it. And I don't know how much more we can productize one use case, because every time a service provider like ourselves, DT, Orange, try to work through a use case, there is a lot of noise coming. Can someone mute that? So basically, we have to see the evolution of the product to the stage where we can start taking a random use case and we can run through that and we can still execute that use case successfully. So either we exercise with the free 5GC or we exercise with the ORAN network functions. I think these are just examples for us to work through and to find the flexibility of the Nephew architecture, the Nephew model, our SDKs, and everything that is evolving in the basic set that is the enabler of all the other use cases. What I'm trying to say is that those functional capabilities of the product and its vision and the project has to evolve. So more and more use cases can be built on top of that basic function. And
Yeah,
maybe
no,
that's the
no,
direction.
yeah, that is the direction. But I mean, if you don't have continuity of the use cases that you put, we just dropped these two use cases. I feel that's I mean, R3. If you look at working group 2, I would have expected working group 2 still to continue on something like workload cluster deployments or infrastructure management kind of stories and 5G core and ORAN. So because then you have use case stories that you're carrying forward that towards that maturity, but there's new things that you're actually taking on too, right? So it all depends on, and if you see, look at it right now with something R1, R2, can you do something in your own lab with with all the vendors and the cloud providers that you use? So that's a basic question I think every operator must be kind of asking themselves with Nephew, right?
Right, you're right.
Yeah, my 2 cents.
Thanks.
When we
Thanks,
talk about
Ravi.
what I'm thinking about, what kind of use cases could we realize with it, because nobody actually supports kind of, and the interfaces themselves are kind of at a very premature stage, and I don't think there's implementation of anything even in open source yet, I guess.
I agree with you. A lot of things are evolving, and so is Nephew. We are all at an early stage, and I think we are gradually moving towards the stage where we could take the code, start a POC in our own basically labs, start to drive our own use cases through it, and then that will also drive some of the evolution. And it's an incremental process, and we are at an early stage of that process. So all agreed on that.
Okay.
Any other questions before we move on to the work group 4 and 5?
Tim just raised his hand again, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, Tim.
So just I want to clarify something here, right? All right. So I think with respect to what Ravi said, I think he's correct. Is that right now we only have ORAN as the use cases, and he's absolutely right. We should have core use cases that existed and that they extend on, and that should be something. There should be a group for and decide how they're going to want to extend that for the core side. I don't disagree with that. I will say that there are open source. The ORAN open source community has aspects that we're talking about already. I've seen some proof of concepts from various vendors on the SMO to OCloud that was just done. For example, Fujitsu and Wind River just showed that using the specification. So to say that there's nothing out there, I think is actually not necessarily true. And so, but again, maybe some of that stuff is all still POC first, as Wim said. I have no issue with that. But to discount an area like ORAN integration at this point, again, we picked this time to jump in, right? So because we think that there are enablers that can help us do this, right? And if there's not, then maybe we jumped in too early. Not sure, but I think that stuff was there for us to jump in. So I do think that that maybe those groups organize members that are interested in evolving some of these other aspects of providing enablers by demonstrating that through the free 5G C or the OEI core or whatever it is. I think we have those use cases should still exist, right? I don't think we're taking out any of those existing use cases. And from ORAN's perspective, we're going to use them. We want to use the enablers that are there, right? And then figure out if there's a problem with that we have. There's a mismatch between our expectations, what the enablers are able to provide. That's what we're hoping to have that discussion in by the end of January. Okay, so I'm just saying that it's not that ORAN isn't there. There's pieces already there, both in the open source community as well as in some vendor proof of concepts.
And I agree with you, Tim. There are different ways how people look at the ORAN maturity. There are things that can be accomplished with ORAN's architecture today. And if you try to boil the ocean, then we believe that a lot of interfaces and specs are not defined. So basically how we look at ORAN is what we basically say. The glass is half full or half empty is basically the way we say.
And that's the way it is too. Yeah,
Yes,
you're absolutely
yes,
right.
right. And we have been in a lot of internal discussions about ORAN as well on that model. There's something incremental, something simple that we can accomplish with the ORAN vision architecture even today. And we talked about some of those initial deployment configuration use cases. Even if they're not fully compliant to the specs, they are gradually getting compliant to the specs as specs are also evolving. So all good. What I feel should happen right now with all the good discussion that is happening, Kaushik, if we can start a document on proposals, maybe people can start putting in these ideas in a document, which would say potential user stories for R3. They're not a formal ask right now, and the document can stay open for a long time. Whatever working groups are thinking about, maybe we can start dumping in the stories. We can start the actual review of that document's inputs once we hit that milestone, which is November 15th, which I believe is the right time for the SIG1 and SIG2 to come together to brainstorm more on those proposals. But I think that document can start now. So maybe Ravi can insert his thought in a document, say, whatever has been accomplished for 5G core, pre-5GC, maybe a good next incremental step is to continue to use the pre-5GC network functions and advance that towards a working group 5 use case. Maybe let's consider a full closed loop of the service assurance over an existing network function deployment, because network function deployment is the prerequisite for us to accomplish something on the policy and closed loop. Maybe Tim would throw a few ideas there that for ORAN, the rest of the architecture is still evolving, but these are the couple of use cases that we can pick up as low-hanging fruit, and that is proposals in the document. So these things can go into a document as we work on the other working groups. And we will probably start looking at that from November 15th when we start those joint SIG1, SIG2 meetings and start to review the process for R3.
By the way, Tal raised his hand. Tal and Kaushik.
Okay,
had their
sorry.
hands up.
Oh, please, sorry, please go ahead. I can't see them, so
Yeah,
sorry.
it's okay. Yeah, I want to suggest that when people present, you maybe organize your windows in such a way that you still see the Zoom window. But I think
How
people
do
tend
I
to
see that? Yeah, Tal, I'm
So
right
you
here.
can,
I can
good
experiment.
question. Yeah, I've been experimenting with it too. I think what you can do is drag out the tab for the Zoom window, and then it'll be just a separate window on your screen, and you only share the tab that you want to share on the screen. I don't know if it'll work on every operating system and browser, but in my case, yeah, I use Zoom in the browser. But if you have a Zoom client, I think you can just put the windows side by side on your screen, so you can see that.
Okay.
Anyway, we can experiment.
I will. Yeah, I'll
That's a very
experiment
meta
later.
comment.
I know.
Yeah, yeah.
Keep
A
going. You
meta
had a
comment.
question.
But the more direct two comments maybe is, well, one, I think we've kind of fallen into this idea that we need a very waterfall approach to design, where we have a very, very clear design from SIG1, and until we do that, SIG2 is blocked from doing anything. I want to encourage us maybe to think in a more agile way, and I know agile is a bit of a buzzword, but my point is that remember, I really try to push us early on to think of these in terms of POCs, right? ORAN POC, observability POC, Tosca POC. And we're actually already doing that in SIG2 with some of our features. The topology controller, for example, we know that in the release notes, we're going to emphasize that it's an early stage, experimental feature, if you will, right? So I think that if we really need everything perfect from SIG1, it's going to be very hard to move forward in actual implementation. So by agile, what I would mean here is maybe a more piecemeal approach, where we have some ideas and we can start experimenting with them and then evolve them, right? So at least we make some progress in SIG2 and we're not waiting and being blocked. And it's especially true for ORAN. All we said, ORAN is not ready, so we don't have to be blocked. right? But internally, we don't have to be block 2 and the interface between the two SIGs. So I think we need to find a way to be more efficient about this and not make everything perfect, but rather find something small that SIG2 can start working with, right? Some sort of an idea.
Right. And all you and Wim being in this SIG, I probably don't know who other is strictly attending, and Balaji is very close to SIG automation as well. With you guys cross-pollinating here, I think are constantly sensing the opportunities and ideas being discussed and evolving in this group at the same time. So it's doable, what you're saying. It has to be agile.
Oh,
Yeah.
I think, maybe I'll quickly
Go ahead.
respond, but I think we are doing that somehow, Tal, right? The only thing that I see, right now, if you compare to our one where we didn't have any POCs, right? The focus of the core is very small. That's just an observation.
Yeah, I think that's a
Right?
correct observation.
And so the result is that it's way more harder to struggle to do something in core with all the POCs, because almost everybody is focusing on these POCs these days, and the result is that you have hardly any people or airtime to do anything in core.
Yeah, this is a separate problem we'll have to discuss in SIG2. Our
Yeah.
release cycle has been very paralyzing for us. We kind of moved from R1 to R2 and with a very tiny window to actually do work. So that needs to be more agile too. We discussed some ideas on how to do it, but that'll be a SIG2 discussion. For SIG1, I think I want us to maybe have a more agile attitude. Right, to our design. So our design documents don't have to be perfect. I think they can start with something and say, hey, here's something we can do. And so now, as you see, we do have people from SIG2 here. Absolutely, we're part of the discussion, including in the work groups, right? In the SIG1 work groups.
Yes.
So yeah, it's not a very operational suggestion that I'm making. It's more of an attitude suggestion. Yeah.
Right. I get it. So basically, in that sense, I asked Kaushik to open a document where we can get the incremental feedback from every single person thinking about that could be a next use case. And we can constantly throw those ideas there so that we can pick those ideas up, and wherever there's an opportunity for low-hanging fruit where we can say, oh, this thing should not be waiting for R3 release cycle. This could be a POC. Maybe someone can jump on it and someone can start working on it. I want something like that started. Maybe that will improve the agility that Saul's talking about. And sorry, Kaushik, you have raised hand as well. And Tal, go ahead. You guys have raised hands.
Yeah, no, Tal, did you want to respond to anything else or?
Leftover hand.
Okay. Yes, no, I agree with Tal also. I think I would still say we should document also this part about leaner and more, not a complete waterfall like model also as part of the process doc, because I think what is happening is just it's okay, we can always open up these documents to solicit ideas and so forth. They all come in different shapes and forms, rightfully so, and then we spend a lot of time discussing and debating. I think that is where the crux of the matter lies. Instead of discussing and debating too much to refine it and try to somewhat make it close to perfection in terms of CUJs, we should just identify at a high level, hey, this is an important topic or theme. Let's start with the POC, right? And the POC could be led by SIG1 working groups, or it could be SIG1 plus 2, whatever be the form structure. It is only once the POC reasonably shapes up is where some of the details of the CUJ will naturally emerge. I think that is what I assume Tal is also trying to say is it's okay to do the first level of solicitation of ideas or topics. It's the subsequent process which needs refinement.
Yeah, I agree. Kaushik, how can we start to work on that process? And maybe that could be a
I think, like I said, we should just document this process in the process document that we took an action for. We should just document this part of the process as well, right? Like, what does a planning process look like, right? Generally, and which of the topics could be already well formed, which of the topics need POC development to refine the thinking, the CUJs or the design or whatever be that. Like, I think we should document that, and we should describe the roles and relationships of the different working groups of SIG1 as well as SIG1 plus 2 overlaps or joint ownerships, if you may. I think it is all related, because the process of planning for a release is intertied to how what Tal brought up in terms of the waterfall model. So they all, I look at them as the same problem.
Yes, completely agreed. Kaushik, let's work on that process document somehow and then bring it for discussion in the next SIG-1 meeting. That will help everybody align on that vision, and we can all start to work in that around that process. We have 5 more minutes left, and I was going to ask the 2 remaining working groups, what do we do? So working group 4 update, Sandeep.
Yeah, he's on travel.
Yeah, I
Yes,
see his note on the chat.
Yeah.
Anybody from work group 4? Bernard, do you guys need something? I saw some comments, some discussions for work group 4 this morning.
Yeah, I believe Sandeep has started sort of fleshing out sort of a certain structure regarding a joint sort of discussion around user experience and modeling. I believe there's a to and fro regarding sort of the scoping of this working group. I initially sort of thought that we would be only sort of focusing on modeling. Now we've got this user experience part back in again. And I believe if Sandeep is driving this topic, then basically he can also structure the communication around that. I must admit, I was currently very much more sort of wanting to see that we can flesh out the basic principles of how we would structure KRMs, etc. And the behavior of operators in this context, and not so much on sort of the user experience part. So therefore, I believe Sandeep would be the best person to sort of structure the next steps here.
So the user experience and modeling could be different subgroups or different activities, and Tall has a lot to basically contribute in the modeling
Yes.
work as well.
That was my original idea, but again, sort of, I believe there's still sort of this mixture of both aspects being addressed now in the working group 4, and until we either sort of decide to separate it or sort of come up with a sort of a combined approach, we would then have sort of an understanding of how to proceed here.
Yeah,
so you guys continue to work.
Bernard, this topic was also you brought it, and some others also brought it up. There are a couple action items that I took note of in the last SIG-1 meeting. We'll need to work on that, Sana, because this is exactly what I said at the start of the meeting. The whole modeling and UX needs a little bit follow through in terms of scope, and overlays with rest of the working groups or with SIG2. So I think once we do that, I think that is the topmost priority. Once we do that, Bernard, hopefully all of your questions hopefully will get addressed.
Yeah, agreed, Kaushik. Let's look into that as well.
By the way, just one process observation, it's not a out of the world thing, is we seem to take lots of action items as a community. We don't really act on it. We don't always assign clear owners. When there are owners, the owners don't make progress. We don't have ETAs. We don't track previous action items. So we need to really solidify and create that right rigor and discipline. Otherwise, we seem to discuss lots of things. They again repeat. It's somewhat suboptimal in my opinion. I don't know if how other working groups SIGs are restructuring the process, but I just feel in SIG-1 it has not been it doesn't seem to be a well established machinery. So
Kaushik, should we be working like the product owners, like the scrum masters, where we have like a dashboard with actions and action items and assigning people and assigning PTs, like start a board like that? Like, I'm not kidding. If that's what we need to do to drive this more effectively, we can do that, like a Kanban board or something like that.
Yeah, again, I didn't want to open up a hornet's nest right now, but like I'm okay to be less process heavy either. In the end, it also boils down to how each of us are self-responsible, right? If we all make the effort to do it, we don't need a lot of process override like Scrum Masters and so forth. But if not, maybe that is how we'll need to do it. I'm okay with either way, lightweight or heavyweight approach. My meta observation is we need to be, as a group, we need to be more disciplined.
Yes. And I'm very happy that you didn't mean to do that. So good for me, good for you. And the point taken, Kaushik. Things that we take actions for is our responsibility to follow up and remember. the ideas and bring back what we were supposed to bring back for that. And I think we have almost time over. We have the work group 5. I wanted to hear that they're all set. They have their meeting set up. We should probably quickly hear from work group 5 situation, and we'll wrap the meeting up then.
Yeah, hi Sana, Subhash here.
Hi,
So yeah,
Subhash.
we are regularly meeting, and we are setting our objectives. So we are solidifying it, and also we are communicating with the observability team, and we have had some session along with them to understand how we can collaborate. And yeah, next thing for us to identify to concretely identify or come up with some common use case, so that we are discussing in our meetings, and we are trying to get some consensus on it, and we'll go for the implementation after that. And these were the updates from our work group.
Excellent, Subhash. We should also do a work group update. We didn't find time while we were discussing the structure of the working groups and the roles and responsibilities and improving the process, but we will from next time on try to make time for the work group updates and the progress as well. And we are getting there. So thanks for everyone's.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Hey, Sana, just one for you. I'm in the US this week, so hopefully I'll be able to carve out some time to sit with you. We need to really tabulate all the action items, prioritize them, assign owners where we can. We just need to do at least some level of process as a starting point, and we'll need to figure out how to keep that going forward. I'll need to drop, Sana, unfortunately, but let's meet later, like sometime during this week, to really establish a good process.
Absolutely, Ashok. I'll be happy to meet in this time zone with you. Good that you're here. Perfect. Sounds good. Thanks, everyone. We can wrap up. Until next SIG meeting. We'll see everybody there. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.